In this final section of Lecture 6, I'm going to talk about a third main theme which characterised the period from World War II to the present, and this is the substantial growth in female labour force participation. In this graph, I've chosen two countries where I could get data going back for a reasonable period to show growth in the employment rate of females aged 15 plus. And you can see in the US, we start out at about 35% of females aged 15 and over being employed in the paid workforce in 1955, and then by the 2000s that's increased by about 20 percentage points to 55%. In Australia, over a shorter period from 1965 to 2010, you get the same increase occurring from the low 30% up to the mid 50%. So this is an almost doubling of the extent of female involvement in employment in the paid workforce during this period after World War II. In the next graph, I've shown data for an earlier historical period for females just from the US, again aged 15 plus years. This time the data are for labour force participation, so that is females who are both employed and who are looking for work in the paid workforce. And there are 2 points to take out of this graph. One is that you can see that even though I'm focusing on the period after World War II, there was, in the US at least, some gradual increase in female labour force participation even prior to World War II. So you can see participation increasing from about 20% to about 25% during the 50 years from 1890 to 1940. So not as rapid as the period after the war, but some increase. The other thing you notice sort of about this graph is that the participation rate for single women is above the participation rate for married women, and that they're both increasing, the married rate sort of converging up. This tells us a little bit about why the participation rate in places like the US and other countries such as Australia and other industrialised countries such as Europe have been increasing. Part of it is that you're getting increases in participation for both single and married women, and in particular for married women. So basically the participation rate's increasing because both groups are having higher participation, in particular married women. The other thing that's happening though is that the proportion of women who are single at particular ages has increased over time. And because the participation rate for single women is above the participation rate for married women, we're switching women from a category with a relatively lower to a relatively higher participation rate. So the lengthening of time before marriage, for example, is also something that tends to push up the labour force participation rate. So we've had this large increase in female participation in the workforce in the period after World War II. What are the reasons that's happened? One reason is changes to the types of jobs that are available. So, for example, the growth of white-collar employment, and that's really something that in the United States goes back to sort of the early part of the 20th century, but then has continued sort of throughout. The growth of white-collar employment has provided types of jobs to allow females to increasingly enter the workforce, and also the increasing availability, especially sort of in the period after World War II, of part-time employment is something that has again increasingly allowed females to take up types of jobs that, for example, allow them to combine working in the paid workforce with child rearing, child caring activities. So part of the explanation for female participation is just that the types of jobs in the economy have changed. Second explanation is growth in education attainment. So with increasing proportions of females continuing on to complete high school, continuing on to university and obtaining university degrees, that increasingly gives them the skills that allows them to be matched with available jobs in the workforce. Now obviously, between these two factors and between some of the other factors I talk about here, there's going to be some overlap. So one reason that you might think that females increasingly sort of sought higher levels of educational attainment is the increasing availability of jobs which suit, for example, or match with family responsibilities. So, for example, with a greater availability of white-collar jobs for females, that gives an incentive to acquire increasing education attainment to be able to take up those jobs. Another explanation is new household technology. So with females generally having been more responsible for housework, a reduction in the amount of time needed to do tasks in the household has allowed more time to be spent or to be allocated towards paid work activities. And so this table gives you a bit of a feel for changes in some of the facilities in households. So, by World War II, it was pretty much the case that a large proportion of houses had running water and electrical lighting, but, some increase sort of in the period through to the 1950s and 1960s. But also you get these automated devices like mechanical refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, increasingly reducing the amount of time that needs to be spent on household activities. So compared to in the US in the 1920s, when it's estimated about, on average, a household spent about 25 hours a week on housework, by 1975 that had come down to 10 hours a week. There are other sort of particular events or developments which affected female participation during this period. So one effect was the demonstration effect of World War II. So in World War II, with large numbers of males having to leave the industrial workforce in the US to move as military forces to other parts of the world, there was a shortage of labour in the US that was available to do those tasks. And so there was a large campaign to try and attract women into the workforce. And to some extent, that seems to have changed social attitudes, created a skill base for women to remain in the workforce after that. There's also the contraceptive pill, which, for example, by allowing lengthened time before marriage, allowing control over the number of children, has allowed females to reduce the time that they have out of the workforce in childbearing and child rearing activities. And also changes to government legislation in a variety of countries which have increased the likelihood of divorce, give females increased incentive, it appears, to remain with a more substantive contact to the labour market in the event of divorce occurring. Changing social attitudes have also been clearly an important driver of increasing female employment in the workforce. So this is obviously tied up with some of these other developments. So, for example, as females acquire more education, that becomes a basis for changing social attitudes. But changing social attitudes, the idea that it's more acceptable for women to be in the paid workforce sort of is obviously something that then provides a basis for women feeling that it's appropriate to acquire more education. This slide is just an example of the campaign that I mentioned just before, famous campaign called the Rosie the Riveter campaign, based around a metal worker in shipyards in the US who was used to try and attract women into the workforce in the US during World War II. Now, underlying the increase in female participation with some of the explanatory factors I mentioned is a really important phenomenon which the economic historian Claudia Goldin has referred to as the quiet revolution. And she's identified two features associated with this quiet revolution. One is the idea that at some point, as female employment increased, there was almost sort of like a tipping point where a large proportion of women began to think that rather than having sort of a short-term period in the workforce, rather than thinking, well, that you were sure that you would be working sort of before you were married, but then you weren't at all sure whether you would ever work after that, that rather there developed the long-term expectation that you would be involved in the paid workforce sort of for a long period of time. and that once women develop that expectation of long-term participation in the paid workforce, that's when you get this decision-making about thinking that, that you would want to invest more in formal education. So Golden describes this as the idea of an expanded horizon, that at some point you get that rather than that women thinking of employment as a short-term phenomenon, there's a sufficiently large number of women in the workforce who are thinking of a long-term career in the paid workforce, that then has spillover consequences to things like investing more in formal education. And once that happens, that's when you get catch-up in education attainment and in the types of occupations women are doing to males. Golden also talks about altered identity, how if you look at sort of data over the last 40 years or so, you can see a big change in the way women perceive work, that increasingly women perceive work in the paid workforce as a fundamental aspect of life satisfaction and as their as a part of their social world. So for example, increasingly you get women designating recognition from peers and financial remuneration as being key aspects of satisfaction from work. That is converging towards the same type of factors that males had been sort of for long periods identifying as the factors that they associated with work. The final theme I just want to take up really briefly is a big issue with the rise in female employment and participation has been what role has or should government play in promoting greater female participation and employment. And usually there's been two types of policies that are thought about: affirmative action, which in various ways deliberately try to create opportunities for women in the workforce and ensure that they're not disadvantaged in seeking opportunities relative to males. The other type of policy is equal pay. It turns out in most countries around the world, up until sort of at least the 1950s and 1960s, there were actually deliberate policies that females would be paid less than males for doing similar work. And so another big way that governments have tried to intervene, which arguably sort of through increasing pay has also promoted female employment and participation, it was by implementing equal pay. And a major example of that happening was in Australia in 1969 and 72, when Australia introduced the equal pay for equal work and then the equal pay for work of equal value cases. And you can see that sort of around that time you get big increases in the ratio of female to male pay in Australia, going from about 70% up to about 90% sort of by the time those policies are introduced. And so while, for example, there's always been debate about policies like affirmative action, one area where it does seem that government intervenes successfully to sort of level the playing field, remove discrimination in the labour market to some degree is through these equal pay cases. Of course, that's not to say the playing field is completely level at the moment. When we look at sort of data on occupational distribution of employment, when we look at things like the percentage of females on boards in large companies in developed economies around the world, when we look at data on earnings and recognise that even though a country like Australia had these equal pay cases, you can still in studies of wages find components that have to be associated with discrimination of 5 to 10%. That is, males and females doing similar job, are basically being paid differently. Still, you still realise that there's some distance to go in really ensuring fairness between males and females in the workforce.